It being 11:04, the House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Where is it?
Affaires et mandats des députés, debate on motion M-534 on child poverty in the name of Ms. Sitsabaiesan.
Ms. Sitsabaiesan, seconded by Ms. Sims, Newton North Delta, moves that in the opinion of the House, the government should work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities to eradicate child poverty in Canada by developing a national poverty reduction plan that includes A. Logement abordable pour les Canadiens.
A. Making housing more affordable for lower Canadians. B. Ensuring accessible and affordable childcare. C. Addressing childhood nutrition. D. Improving economic security of families. E. Measures that specifically address the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And F. Measurable targets and timelines. Debate.
The honourable member for Scarborough Rouge River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, on the eve of the 25th anniversary, I am very honoured and privileged to stand here and present my motion, M-534, to reiterate our commitment to eradicating child poverty in Canada. Quarter of a century ago, in 1989, a similar motion was introduced by former NDP leader Ed Broadbent, which received unanimous consent in this House to eradicate child poverty by year 2000. And now, 25 years later, here we are, and not much has changed. I don't want to make any accusations about any of the successive Liberal or Conservative governments for not taking proper actions to eliminate child poverty over the last 25 years since this House made the promise and commitment to do so. However, Mr. Speaker, I also cannot just keep quiet and pretend that poverty rates among children have improved compared to 25 years ago, or that Canada is poverty-free. For 25 consecutive years, Canadian children and their families who live in poverty have been left behind and marginalized on the agendas of successive governments. 25 years is a really long time, and it makes me wonder, why is it that almost 1 million Canadian children are living in poverty today, and why have successive governments allowed for the rate of poverty to increase compared to 25 years ago? Once again, that is when we made the promise to eliminate poverty. It makes me wonder if the Liberal and Conservative governments over the last 25 years have felt that the opinions of the impoverished don't matter. What went wrong, Mr. Speaker? Why was the promise to our country's children broken? Mr. Speaker, if we didn't keep the promise to our children, fine. Maybe the governments of the day felt that children don't vote, so maybe they're not a huge priority. But how about the promise that Canada made to the rest of the world when we ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1991? We agreed to upholding international principles, values, and standards. According to Article 27.1, Mr. Speaker, I quote, "States parties recognize the right of every child to a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development," end quote. The section then continues and holds states more responsible by obliging them to, quote, "to take appropriate measures to assist parents and others responsible for the child to implement this right, and shall, in case of need, provide material assistance and support programs, particularly with regard to nutrition, clothing, and housing," end quote. And my motion deals with all of those, Mr. Speaker, deals specifically with nutrition, housing, and childcare, Mr. Speaker. As a state that is a signatory to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, we are also not meeting our commitment globally today. This past week, I spent a lot of time with children in our schools in Scarborough, and many of the children found it quite difficult to imagine that there are children and families who go hungry and cannot afford to have their daily meals. But the reality is that that is what's happening right here in one of the world's richest countries, our great Canada. In their November 7, 2013 report, Campaign 2000 stated that, and I quote, "Food security among families is highly critical, with 1.1 million children experiencing food insecurity, a situation of inadequate or insecure access to food because of financial constraints, and children represent 37% of food bank users in Canada," end quote. According to another recent article by Huffington Post on November 4th of 2014, in Ontario, 375,000 people use the food banks, of which 36% are children. Mr. Speaker, Health Canada's Household Food Insecurity in Select Provinces and Territories 2009-2010 report showed that in Canada's north, Nunavut has the highest number of households in Canada that are food insecure, which is 28.8%, which is more than double what is in the Yukon Territory, which holds second place at 11%. My question is, another question that we might think is that what has the current government done to lower the levels of poverty in Canada? Because when we pose questions in question period, the government says that they have. So let's look at some details, Mr. Speaker, but the reality that you're going to realize is that not much has been done. In fact, some cabinet ministers even demonstrated when the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food was here, quite embarrassing hospitality, and it was quite a shame. The United Nations has also described housing and homelessness in Canada as a national emergency. An estimated 250,000 people are homeless, with another 1.1 million living in inadequate housing, and more than 500,000 are facing a serious financial burden, which threatens their housing security. Over 10% of those identified as homeless are youth ages 16 to 18. In its first Universal Periodic Review, a number of members of the Human Rights Council have expressed significant concerns about poverty and housing in Canada. A number of recommendations were made to enhance the catastrophic situations of housing in Canada, for which we as a nation were heavily criticized. And despite the original denial from the government involuntarily and under pressure accepted some of the recommendations from the member states. Canada agreed to consider taking on board the recommendation of the Special Rapporteur on adequate housing, specifically to extend and enhance the National Homelessness Program and the Residential Rehabilitation Assistance Program. Canada also committed to double its efforts to better ensure the right to adequate housing, especially for vulnerable groups and low-income families. But just when we thought there might be improvements, this current Conservative government voted against Bill C-400, an act to ensure secure, adequate housing, adequate, accessible, and affordable housing for Canadians. They didn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. In the June 2012 budget, they also defunded and closed down the National Council of Welfare, the NCW, which was an organization that highlighted poverty and ensured to warn policymakers of the consequences of neglecting those in need. By eliminating the role of the NCW, the government officially shut down the source of reports and information that truly depicted the depth and breadth of poverty in Canada. Instead of eliminating the problem, poverty, they eliminated the messenger, the NCW. Mr. Speaker, it's kind of like the metaphor where the cat thinks that if it closes its eyes and drinks milk, that nobody around can see it. We've heard the parliamentary secretary stating that we really don't have much of a poverty problem in Canada, when the truth is that we just don't have the National Information Centre, the NCW, to do the research and present any reports to us. Mr. Speaker, this government does not understand that affordable and adequate housing does not only offer shelter, but it also offers individuals and families a sense of stability, security, and motivation. The children I met with last week knew that, and they knew that making sure that they have a roof over their houses meant safety and security for them. We need a comprehensive plan to tackle this issue and save more money for Canadians and the national revenue. According to a study conducted by Homelessness Canada, each year it costs the system approximately $55,000 to leave a homeless person on the street, while providing adequate housing and support services would only cost $37,000, Mr. Speaker. Another report by the Canadian Medical Association in 2013 concluded that child poverty is at the core of socioeconomic problems. Over 20% of healthcare-related expenditure is derived from inadequate housing and the consequences of low-income conditions. Mr. Speaker, by implementing what is being introduced today through my private member's motion, Canadians will benefit on many levels. First, we will do the right thing, removing homeless Canadians from the streets. Second, that will save the Canadians more than $15 billion annually. That's $5 from removing homeless and $10 from savings on health care from inadequate housing, which could be used in other areas that could benefit the Canadians in various tax benefits, and which can finance a national child care program, which is the third piece of the motion, Mr. Speaker. On many occasions, when this government was asked about child poverty rates in Canada, there were no clear reasons as to why the rate of child poverty has increased over the last 25 years. On October 28th, UNICEF issued their annual report card 12, and on November 3rd, they had a symposium, Children in the Wake of the Recession, dedicated to child poverty. Neither in the report nor during the seminar was anything positive said about the current and previous federal government's serious engagement and commitment to eradicating child poverty. Even though the current government and ministers may avoid the facts, Mr. Speaker, poverty is a reality for far too many of Canada's children. And if these irresponsible policies continue, that's going to continue to be the reality for even more of our children. This government likes to acknowledge that 180,000 children were pulled out of poverty due to their great efforts, and they like to celebrate. However, they're always in denial of acknowledging the truth that poverty exists and Canada has a high percentage of child poverty. On several occasions, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of State for Social Development and Minister of Multiculturalism and Social Development have referred to the UNICEF report and quoted only the favourable parts from it. I'd like to bring to their attention that on November 3rd, I was present at the UNICEF's annual symposium to hear from other experts about the report card 12. The government didn't even bother to send a representative there to hear from experts on the ground. The conclusion from the day was that children are worse off today than when the crisis began in 2008, and even much worse off from 25 years ago. Here's some of what the spokespeople of UNICEF Canada had to say on the day that the report card 12 was released, and I quote, "What disturbs us is that the relative poverty rate hasn't budged for many years. As a wealthy country, we are not doing well enough for our children." And that was Lisa Wolfe, the director of UNICEF Canada. Another quote from Tiffany Baguetta, the spokesperson of UNICEF Canada, at the symposium was, "Overall child poverty in Canada has decreased, but children who were the most poor to begin with have slipped further into poverty." So we're not really helping our most vulnerable children, most vulnerable people in our country, who are our children. As you've seen, Mr. Speaker, this government has a trend of doing things in their own way. We know they don't like to have much consultation, and they don't like to listen to experts or people in the field. And it is true that during the recession years, Canada's child poverty rate had decreased from a shameful 23% to a 21%. However, 25 years ago, when this Parliament made the commitment to end poverty among our children, the rate was only 13%, Mr. Speaker. So successive governments have contributed to the child poverty rate increasing from 13% to 23%. And this government is celebrating that it's now at 21%, which is a significant increase from the 13% when we committed to eradicating poverty in this country, Mr. Speaker. Let's compare our country to how we fare with other Scandinavian and UK countries that have actually done a great job in reducing their child poverty rates. The child poverty rates in Nordic countries is actually below 6%. 6%, not 21% like in Canada, Mr. Speaker. What have we done in the past 25 years in this regard, Mr. Speaker? We can go in circles and have the Liberals and Conservatives blame and accuse each other for their irresponsible governing, but those excuses and accusations will not feed the poor or the children in our country, nor will it provide them adequate housing, security, or childcare. Again, let me return to parts of the UNICEF report that this government quotes frequently that leads to this government to believe that they have accomplished the mission of eradicating child poverty by pulling out 180,000 children from poverty. According to Statistics Canada, since 1989, on average, every year, 180,000 to 250,000 children are actually removed from the category of poor children. Regardless of all these numbers, the child poverty rate has continued to increase despite the fact that the fertility rate has not increased in the same time period, which means we're not having more children. Same number of children are being removed from poverty because they're aging out, and yet our poverty rates continue to grow. In fact, Mr. Speaker, none of the previous governments have done enough. There are many factors that have contributed in removing these 180,000 children from poverty. 12 to 15% of those children who were 17 years of age became 18 and got removed from the count of child poverty. So basically, we've removed them from the number of child poverty to adults living in poverty, and more than 23,000 of them are now homeless. Over 70% of those children and their families were lifted above the poverty line due to the efforts of provincial governments, private corporations or NGOs, charities, and other social agencies such as food banks and shelters. Mr. Speaker, UNICEF's, you're giving me the 1 minute note, and I have so much more to say, Mr. Speaker. Poverty is also racialized in our country, and we must notice that I'm going to give you some stats from the GTA before I conclude, Mr. Speaker. Among the broad ethno-racial groups in the GTA, the rates of child poverty were about 1 in 10 in global European groups, 1 in 5 for East Asian groups, 1 in 4 for Aboriginal, South Asian, and Caribbean groups, 1 in 3 for children of Arab and West Asian groups, and 1 in 2 for children of African groups. Today, the GTA has 79% of Ontario's immigrants and 81% of Ontario's visible minorities. This means that far too many of our racialized people living in the GTA are living in poverty. Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude by saying that implementing a national strategy to eradicate poverty will have a positive impact on our Canadian economy in both the short and the long run, and high levels of child poverty generate very significant and growing human and fiscal costs to society and the economy in the long run. Mr. Speaker, this motion calls for the eradication of child poverty by investing in affordable and accessible housing, and affordable and accessible childcare, and child nutrition programs. And those are the three social determinants of poverty amongst our children. And, Mr. Speaker, it is our responsibility as the lawmakers of this country to ensure that we are investing in the most vulnerable people in our country and our society, our country's children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll now have 5 minutes of questions.